when were you last over here?
1932, wasn't it?
That's right. 1932. Now you're over here again. What are you going to do?
Well, we're going to do some personal appearances and also a picture. Make the people happy, and will you keep quiet a minute?
He kept his phone number listed in the Santa Monica directory until the day he died, and strangers called him just to hear him laugh. Most of them had no idea that the man on the other end of the line had buried a child, survived 5 marriages, watched his own legs give out from strokes, and spent his final years answering the door alone in a small rented apartment, far from the mansions his fame should have brought him. This is the story of Stan Laurel, the trembling, bewildered little man in the bowler hat who built one of the most beloved comedy partnerships the world has ever seen, while quietly absorbing one loss after another behind the laughter. Long before anyone knew the name Stan Laurel, there was a boy named Arthur Stanley Jefferson, born on June 16, 1890, in the modest market town of Ulverston, in England's Lancashire region. The world he entered was lit by gas lamps and ruled by Queen Victoria, a place where moving pictures did not yet exist and the idea of global celebrity would have sounded like fantasy. But theater ran through his family like a second bloodstream. His father, Arthur Jefferson, managed playhouses and acted on their stages, while his mother, Margaret, known to everyone as Madge, was a performer in her own right. Because theatrical work meant constant relocation, young Arthur spent much of his boyhood shuttled between grandparents, boarding schools, and whatever town his parents' current production happened to be playing. While other children were learning games in a schoolyard, he was learning the geography of backstage corridors, watching actors transform themselves under gaslight, and absorbing, almost by osmosis, the rhythm of a live audience deciding in real time whether something was funny. By 16, he was already earning a wage on stage, stepping into one of the most punishing apprenticeships show business has ever produced, the British music hall circuit. There was no forgiveness in that world. A joke either landed or it didn't, and there was no editing room to fix a bad night. Out of that unforgiving grind came the foundation of everything he would later become, an instinct for the exact half-second a gesture needed to hold before it became funny, and an understanding that comedy was less about jokes and more about behavior. He studied the comedians who came before him with the seriousness of an apprentice studying a trade, particularly admiring performers known for finding pathos inside silliness rather than relying purely on slapstick for its own sake. That distinction, between comedy that simply provoked a laugh and comedy that made an audience feel something for the fool on stage, would eventually become the quiet engine of his entire career. In 1910, this young performer joined the company of Fred Karno, a producer famous for elaborate, almost wordless pantomime sketches built on collisions, pratfalls, and perfectly engineered chaos. Karno's operation functioned almost like a factory for physical comedy, with sketches drilled and re-drilled until every stumble looked accidental rather than rehearsed 100 times over. It was here that he worked alongside another rising English comic chasing the same uncertain dream, a young man named Charlie Chaplin. For a period, the future Stan Laurel actually served as Chaplin's understudy within the troupe, stepping into his roles whenever Chaplin was unavailable, an arrangement that placed the two young performers in constant, quiet competition with one another. Neither of them was famous yet. They were simply two hungry performers competing for stage time, sharing cramped lodgings and uncertain pay, with no way of knowing that both would eventually become titans of silent film, admired on opposite ends of a comparison that would follow them for the rest of their lives. That same year, Karno's troupe sailed for North America, and the young Englishman found himself thrown into a vaudeville landscape that was as crowded as it was unforgiving. Thousands of comedians and song and dance acts were touring the same circuits, fighting over the same bookings, and most of them disappeared into obscurity. Touring meant long train rides, cheap boarding houses, an income that could vanish as quickly as it appeared. America itself was changing at breakneck speed during these years. Cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia were swelling with new arrivals, and Nickelodeons and vaudeville houses were multiplying to feed an appetite for cheap, accessible entertainment. The young performer's physical style of comedy traveled well across that mixed, multilingual audience, since a perfectly timed pratfall needed no translation. But it was during these years that he began calling himself Stan Laurel, a name shorter, easier to remember, and easier to print on a marquee than Arthur Stanley Jefferson. The rebrand was more than cosmetic. It marked the beginning of a public identity that would, over the following decades, increasingly diverge from the private man living underneath it. Through much of the 1910s, Laurel ground out a living in vaudeville while a new industry quietly grew up around him. Many stage veterans dismissed motion pictures as a passing novelty. Laurel, instead, began paying close attention, and gradually shifted his work toward the screen, taking small early film roles whenever they appeared between stage bookings. It was also during this period that Laurel entered a long, informal partnership with an Australian performer named May Dahlborg, with whom he lived as a common-law couple for roughly 6 years, the two of them often billing themselves together in vaudeville acts and early short films. Dahlborg was a presence both on stage and off, and by her own account, it was she who suggested he adopt the surname Laurel, reasoning that his old stage name carried unlucky 13 letters. As his film career began to take shape through a series of short comedies, their relationship became a complication rather than an asset. One producer who wanted Laurel for a run of 2 reel comedies grew wary of Dahlborg's involvement and her influence over his choices, and the contract he eventually signed contained an unusual clause specifically barring her from appearing in any of the films. Not long after, that same producer quietly arranged her return to Australia with a cash settlement and a one-way ticket, which she accepted. It would not be the last time she resurfaced in his life. Years later, after Laurel had become genuinely famous and was already navigating the messy end of a different marriage, Dahlborg came back to the United States and sued him for financial support, adding fresh legal noise to a period when his personal life was already unraveling on other fronts. The matter was eventually settled out of court, but it was one more reminder that very little about Laurel's private history stayed private for long. The true turning point arrived once Laurel began working steadily for Hal Roach Studios in Culver City, California, a smaller, faster-moving operation than the major dramatic studios, built specifically around short comedies designed for rapid production and wide release. Laurel did not simply act there. He wrote, directed, and helped construct the visual logic of the gags themselves, developing a reputation as a meticulous craftsman who could see, in advance, exactly how a stumble or a slow burn would read on screen. The pace at Roach was relentless, with new 2-reel comedies expected on a near-constant schedule and budgets tight enough that every minute of footage had to earn its place. Working in the same orbit was Oliver Hardy, an actor who had already spent over a decade in front of cameras, frequently playing blustering authority figures and pompous antagonists in dozens of comedies and dramas. The two had actually crossed paths on screen once before, in a 1921 short where Laurel played a hapless tramp and Hardy briefly appeared as a small-time crook, though neither man thought much of it at the time. For a while afterward, they simply appeared in overlapping Roach productions without being framed as a fixed duo, sometimes sharing scenes, sometimes occupying entirely separate films, while the studio experimented with different pairings across its roster of contract players. Then, gradually, almost by accident, something clicked. Audiences responded to a very specific contrast: Laurel's wide-eyed, childlike confusion set against Hardy's wounded, simmering dignity, the kind of contrast that turned ordinary mishaps, a piano on a staircase or a single misplaced pie, into miniature dramas of humiliation and reluctant friendship. By the back half of the 1920s, the studio had stumbled into one of the most durable formulas in the history of screen comedy, and Laurel, far from being a passive performer in it, had a direct hand in shaping its internal mechanics, refining the timing, the repetition, and the slow escalation that made their routines feel inevitable rather than rehearsed. Colleagues at the studio would later describe long rehearsal sessions where Laurel walked through a piece of business again and again, adjusting the pause between a glance and a reaction by what might have looked, to an outsider, like an imperceptible fraction of a second, but which on screen made the difference between a routine that merely worked and one that became iconic. The arrival of synchronized sound in the late 1920s ended the careers of many silent-era stars who could not adapt their visual instincts to dialogue and vocal rhythm. Laurel and Hardy made the leap more gracefully than most, and their popularity, instead of shrinking, expanded internationally, since their brand of physical comedy required no fluency in English to land. By the early 1930s they were among the most recognized entertainers on the planet, and in 1932 they reached one of the clearest creative peaks of their partnership with a short film called The Music Box, an extended set piece about the agonizing task of hauling a piano up an absurdly long flight of stairs. The film won the Academy Award for live-action short comedy. Yet success on this scale came wrapped in a familiar Hollywood injustice. Studio contracts of the period rarely granted performers ownership over what they created, and despite Laurel's deep involvement in writing and shaping their material, public credit overwhelmingly settled on Laurel and Hardy as a packaged brand rather than recognizing the individual labor behind it. Even so, the partnership endured for decades, eventually spanning more than 100 films and short subjects. While his professional life was reaching new heights, Laurel's domestic life was already absorbing strain that the public rarely saw. In 1926, he married actress Lois Nielsen, a fellow performer he had known for years and who had been quietly building her own career in silent pictures. The following year their daughter, also named Lois, was born, and for a moment, it looked like the steadiness that had eluded him for years was finally settling into place. He was, by the accounts of those who knew the family, a doting and attentive father, eager to be home between productions despite a filming schedule that left him little room for rest. Then, in May 1930, Nielsen gave birth to a son, Stanley, born nearly 2 months premature. Medical care for premature infants in 1930 was extremely limited even in a major American city, and the child lived only 9 days. There were no neonatal intensive care units, no advanced respiratory support, almost none of the interventions that might exist today. By some accounts, Laurel was so undone by the experience that he chose to have his son cremated rather than endure a funeral. Already overwhelmed by grief, he had nowhere to put. The contradiction of his life at that moment was almost unbearable. On screen, he was part of an industrial-scale laughter machine that demanded constant new material, while at home he was absorbing a loss that the demanding studio schedule gave him almost no room to process. There was no pause in the release calendar, no extended leave to mourn. The cameras kept rolling, and Laurel kept performing, because that was simply how the business worked. Friends and later biographers described a noticeable shift in his temperament afterward, a kind of permanent undercurrent of grief running beneath the public performance, something colleagues sensed in unguarded moments even as the finished films betrayed nothing. The marriage to Nielsen did not survive the strain indefinitely. The couple separated gradually over the following years before finally divorcing in December 1934, closing the chapter on the one relationship that had briefly seemed to offer Laurel some lasting domestic stability. What followed was one of the most chaotic stretches of Laurel's private life, a string of marriages and separations that played out, often humiliatingly, in newspapers that delighted in tracking the love life of one of the world's most recognizable comedians. In 1935 he married Virginia Ruth Rogers, known to friends as Ruth, hoping perhaps that a fresh start might settle the turbulence that had followed his first divorce. The relationship faltered quickly, and during the divorce proceedings 2 years later it became public that Laurel had openly admitted he was still emotionally attached to his first wife, a confession that effectively ended any chance of saving the second marriage and gave gossip columnists weeks of material. Almost immediately afterward, on New Year's Day of 1938, Laurel married a Russian-born singer named Vera Ivanovna-Shuvalova, who performed under the name Ileana. The relationship moved at a startling pace, with the couple marrying only weeks after meeting, and the timing was so tight against his prior divorce that his previous wife publicly accused him of bigamy, even though the earlier divorce had in fact been finalized just days before the new wedding. The marriage to Ileana quickly became one of the most talked about scandals in Hollywood gossip columns of the era, marked by volatile arguments and a deteriorating home life that reportedly included repeated run-ins with local authorities. Among the more sensational claims that circulated at the time was an accusation from Ileana that Laurel had threatened to bury her alive in the backyard of their San Fernando Valley home, an allegation that became part of Hollywood tabloid lore regardless of how it might have actually unfolded behind closed doors. The couple separated within a year and divorced in 1940, with Ileana relinquishing any claim to the Laurel name in exchange for a financial settlement reported at several $1,000s. Remarkably, Laurel then returned to Virginia Ruth Rogers in 1941, attempting to rebuild a relationship that had already failed once, a pattern that recurred throughout his personal life, repeated efforts to repair what had already broken, despite a track record suggesting it rarely worked. Those who knew him at the time suggested it spoke to a deeper restlessness, a man who had spent his entire adult life performing contentment on screen while struggling to locate it in his own home. This second attempt with Rogers lasted longer than the first but ultimately ended the same way, with a final divorce in 1946, closing out more than a decade defined by reconciliation attempts that never quite held. Later that same year, Laurel married Ida Kitiva Raphael, a Russian-born dancer and actress he had met through mutual friends in the entertainment community, and for the first time in nearly 2 decades, his personal life found something resembling stability. Ida remained his wife for the rest of his life, a steady, grounding presence during the most difficult and isolating years that were still ahead of him, and one that many who knew Laurel late in life credited with finally giving him the calm domestic footing his career had never allowed. Professionally, the foundation that had supported Laurel and Hardy for so long began to erode once they left Hal Roach Studios in 1940. Roach had provided not just financing but a tightly controlled creative environment that had been refined across hundreds of short films, a system in which Laurel's instincts for pacing and structure had room to shape every stage of production. Without that structure, the duo struggled to replicate the same precision in feature-length work for other studios. When they signed with 20th Century Fox in the early 1940s, Laurel discovered, to his frustration, that the new arrangement treated him and Hardy purely as actors, with no input into writing, staging, or editing, the very contributions that had given their earlier work its distinctive rhythm. He was, in effect, asked to perform a creative identity that the studio system no longer allowed him to actually build. The films that followed were generally considered weaker than their Roach-era work, hampered by tighter budgets, less consistent production teams, and a creative ecosystem that no longer resembled the one in which their comedic language had been built. Reviews grew more lukewarm, audiences thinned slightly, and the team that had once defined an entire era of comedy now found itself competing for relevance against newer acts better suited to the studio's commercial priorities. The lowest point came with a troubled international production released in the United States as Utopia, filmed in the early 1950s as a French and Italian co-production, which collapsed under language barriers, inconsistent direction, and shifting crews who often could not communicate with one another on set. Both men were already in poor health during filming, with Hardy battling weight-related complications and Laurel managing his own deteriorating condition, and what had been intended as a comeback instead became a physically and emotionally draining ordeal that took a visible toll on whatever time they had left together. Contemporary accounts from the production described long delays, financing troubles, and a finished film that bore little resemblance to the polished comedies that had made their names. It would prove to be their final work together on screen, a quiet, difficult end to a partnership that had once seemed unstoppable. By the mid-1950s, the cumulative weight of decades of demanding work and personal strain was becoming impossible to ignore. Oliver Hardy, once known for his commanding physical presence, suffered multiple strokes and developed serious heart complications that severely limited his mobility and speech. Laurel was contending with his own declining health, including a stroke of his own in 1955. There had been quiet talk of moving the duo into television as the medium expanded rapidly across American households, a logical next step that might have extended their relevance into a new era, but those plans never came together, leaving what could have been a second act as an unrealized possibility. Laurel watched his closest collaborator and friend decline over several years, a painful reversal of the dynamic that had once defined their screen partnership, until communication between them became increasingly limited by Hardy's condition. On August 7, 1957, Oliver Hardy died in North Hollywood at the age of 65. Laurel was too unwell to attend the funeral, and according to those close to him, he later offered a simple, quietly devastating explanation that Hardy would have understood. With his partner gone, Laurel made a decision that surprised many in the industry. He withdrew almost entirely from performing, turning down offer after offer to return to the screen, including a part in a major ensemble comedy that would go on to feature many of the era's biggest comic stars. Instead, he settled into a quieter life in Santa Monica, choosing a modest apartment over the kind of sprawling estate many of his Hollywood peers favored. One of the more unusual details of these later years was his accessibility. He kept his home telephone number listed publicly, and fans from around the world genuinely called him, often staying on the line for long conversations about comedy, timing, and the mechanics of performance rather than brief, polite greetings. He also corresponded extensively by letter with admirers and younger entertainers, and was visited at times by comedians such as Jerry Lewis and Dick Van Dyke, both of whom would later credit his approach to physical comedy as a meaningful influence on their own work. Even without ever stepping back in front of a camera, Laurel stayed intellectually engaged with the craft that had defined his life, picking apart routines and discussing, almost academically, how humor could be built through movement instead of dialogue. In 1961, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences honored him with an honorary award recognizing his contributions to motion picture comedy, though his declining health meant he was unable to attend the ceremony in person to accept it. Stan Laurel died on February 23, 1965, at the age of 74, in Santa Monica, after suffering a heart attack. His funeral drew friends, longtime colleagues, and figures from across the entertainment industry who understood, even if the wider public never fully did, just how much personal turbulence had been absorbed behind that gentle, bewildered screen persona. He had spent his career manufacturing laughter on an industrial scale for audiences around the world, while privately carrying the weight of a child he barely got to know, marriages that repeatedly collapsed under public scrutiny, the slow loss of creative control over his own life's work, and finally the death of the one professional partner who had understood him better than almost anyone else. The man in the bowler hat made the world laugh for decades. Behind that performance was a life that rarely gave him the same kindness in return.